In the dim light of ancient fires, when the clash of swords and the cries of warriors still echoed across battlefields, men gathered around the remnants of victory, not only to celebrate but to bind themselves to something larger than life itself. The skull, the very vessel of thought and identity, became a sacred object, feared and revered in equal measure. Across different cultures, from the windswept steppes of Eurasia to the shadowed forests of Europe, warriors looked upon the skull not just as a trophy of war but as a symbol of triumph, loyalty, and spiritual power. It was more than bone, it was the distilled essence of an enemy's strength, a reminder of mortality, and a promise of eternal brotherhood when woven into ritual. The skull rituals that emerged in these societies were never random acts of cruelty but practices embedded deeply in their worldview. For the Scythians, for example, to drink from the skull of a defeated foe was not only to proclaim dominance but also to absorb a fragment of their valor. In their eyes, courage and strength could be transferred, the life force of the dead sustaining the living. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described these chilling customs with a mixture of fascination and horror, recognizing that for the nomads of the steppe, survival was inseparable from the sacred performance of violence. The skull became a vessel, transforming blood into wine and death into memory, ensuring that the enemy's presence would never vanish but remain in service to the victor. Among the Celts and Thracians, the skull was treated as a divine relic, believed to house the soul or spirit even after death. Archaeological finds reveal shrines adorned with skulls, sometimes mounted on walls or displayed at entrances, a warning to foes and a protective charm for the tribe. These acts were not mindless brutality but part of a larger spiritual framework where death and life were intertwined. Warriors who shared in these rituals reinforced their bonds through acts that were both terrifying and intimate. To lift a cup crafted from bone and drink alongside one's companions was to enter into an unbreakable oath, a pact sealed by the dead themselves. Such ceremonies created an atmosphere in which loyalty was sacred, betrayal unthinkable, and courage demanded at every turn. The emotional weight of these rituals cannot be overstated. For the men who participated, they were surrounded constantly by death on the battlefield, watching friends and foes fall in the mud and blood. The skull ritual offered a way to give meaning to the chaos. To take the head of an enemy was to transform fear into power, to impose order on the randomness of violence. For the tribe or warband, it was a collective affirmation that their struggle was righteous, their bonds unshakable, and their destiny favored by unseen forces. Even for those who feared such rituals, the very act of witnessing them struck deep into the heart, leaving enemies shaken and allies more tightly bound. At the same time, there was a darker undercurrent, a recognition that such rituals carried with them both honor and horror. To many outsiders, especially Greeks and Romans who encountered these customs, they represented the height of savagery. Yet even those so-called civilized peoples could not deny the power of the symbolism. The skull ritual was not only an expression of cruelty but also of devotion, of transforming the battlefield into a sacred space where warriors proved their worth to each other and to the gods. For the men within those circles of firelight, raising bone to lips was an act of communion, a moment in which individual survival melted into collective identity. As the audience is drawn into this world, the first impression is one of fascination mixed with unease. The skull ritual forces us to confront the extremity of human belief, the lengths to which men would go to bind themselves together, to turn death into loyalty and horror into power. It is a window into a past where the lines between the sacred and the savage blurred, and where warriors believed that through such acts they could transcend mortality itself. This is where our story begins, in the flicker of firelight and the chill of bone, in the ritual that bound warriors together in ways that defy time and still stir our imagination today. Across the windswept steppes of Eurasia, life was a relentless struggle against both the elements and rival tribes. The warriors who roamed these lands, the Scythians, Sarmatians, and later the Huns, were forged in an environment where survival demanded constant readiness for battle. Their rituals reflected this harsh reality, and few were as striking as the transformation of enemy skulls into drinking vessels. To those who lived in this world of endless horseback raids and sudden clashes, the skull was more than a grisly souvenir. It was a reminder of dominance, resilience, and the unbroken cycle of war. In their eyes, every conquest had to be remembered and embodied, and nothing captured that memory more vividly than turning the head of a fallen foe into an object of daily ritual. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, offered chilling accounts of Scythian practices, describing how warriors would carefully clean and gild the skulls of their strongest enemies, then use them as drinking cups during feasts. These gatherings were not simple celebrations of victory, they were sacred affirmations of strength, intended to ensure that the courage of the vanquished lived on in the bodies of the victors. For the Scythians, the act of drinking from an enemy's skull was a declaration that power could be consumed, that valor could pass from one man to another through ritual. It blurred the line between the spiritual and the physical, making conquest a means of both survival and transformation. The steppe environment itself helps explain why such fierce customs developed. Life on horseback meant constant movement, scarce resources, and frequent clashes with rivals who competed for the same pastures. A warrior's reputation was not only his protection but also his identity. By adopting practices that struck terror in enemies and reinforced loyalty among allies, the nomadic peoples ensured their survival. To face the Scythians or later the Huns was not merely to fight against another army but to confront men who believed that the very essence of their fallen foes could fuel them for the next campaign. It created a psychological weapon as potent as their physical skill with bow and horse. The Sarmatians, who inherited much from Scythian tradition, continued and refined these rituals, binding them into a warrior code that emphasized loyalty to the clan. For them, as for many nomadic peoples, the sharing of such a skull cup was more than an act of defiance, it was a ritual of belonging. To drink together from the remains of an enemy was to fuse the group into one body of courage, each sip a silent oath that no man would abandon his brothers in battle. Later, the Huns carried echoes of these customs westward, terrifying the Roman world with their ferocity, their strange faith in the power of death, and their ability to transform slaughter into ceremony. For outsiders, these practices appeared barbaric, proof of the alien and terrifying nature of the steppe warriors. Yet within those societies, the rituals were essential acts of survival and cohesion. They turned war into something sacred, cemented bonds between comrades, and made enemies into unwilling contributors to a warrior's strength. The emotional force of such traditions lay in their ability to give meaning to violence, to assure men that death itself could be conquered through ritual. And in that meaning, warriors of the steppe found not just survival but unity, a brotherhood forged in both blood and bone. When a warrior lifted a skull cup to his lips, it was not always the remains of an enemy that defined the ritual. In many cultures, the transformation of the skull ritual moved beyond conquest and into the realm of brotherhood, where the symbolism of bone and blood was turned inward to unite men into something greater than themselves. To share drink from the same vessel, carved from the ultimate reminder of mortality, was to dissolve the boundaries between individuals and to fuse them into a single entity, bound not by law or king but by oath. For warriors who lived and died by one another's side, loyalty was more than necessity, it was survival, and rituals built around the skull became the deepest way of sealing that survival into permanence. The Thracians, often described by Greek chroniclers as fierce and unpredictable, were said to use skulls in ceremonies that reinforced communal loyalty. Archaeological evidence suggests that skulls were sometimes gilded, turned into sacred vessels not only for boasting but for the reaffirmation of oaths among warriors. These feasts, solemn as much as celebratory, were moments in which every man present was reminded of his mortality. The skull whispered a truth that no one could ignore: life was short, death was near, and only unity could grant a form of immortality. To share from it was to make a promise, binding each man to his comrades with the weight of the dead themselves. Among the Celts, the practice of skull reverence was widespread, and with it came ceremonies of loyalty that blurred the lines between religion and warfare. Skulls were kept in shrines, displayed in sanctuaries, and sometimes used in ritual feasts where warriors swore to protect one another and their tribe. These oaths were not spoken lightly. To betray them was to invite disgrace that lingered long after death. In Celtic belief, the soul continued beyond the grave, watching, judging, and ensuring that promises broken would never be forgotten. The skull therefore was not merely bone, it was witness, guardian, and eternal judge of the pact made in its presence. Even among the Norse and Germanic tribes, echoes of this transformation lingered. Though not always through literal skull cups, they adopted rituals of blood oaths that carried the same symbolic weight. Warriors would mingle blood in bowls or drink from vessels that invoked death, creating bonds as sacred as kinship. The imagery of bone, death, and sacrifice infused these ceremonies with a visceral power. In sagas and legends, such bonds are portrayed as unbreakable, more binding than marriage or bloodline, and betrayal of them was seen as the darkest sin. The skull, whether literal or symbolic, became a tool to remind men that their promises were sanctified not by human law but by forces beyond their control. What makes these rituals so striking is their duality. On the one hand, they were terrifying, grim reminders of how far these societies would go to ensure loyalty. On the other, they were deeply moving, moments where men laid aside individual fears and bound themselves to something larger. The skull was a reminder that death was inevitable, but through unity, one could achieve a form of immortality in the memory of brothers in arms. Every time the vessel was raised, every sip taken in silence or in chant, it was not simply wine or mead that passed between lips but the weight of an oath that could never be undone. The emotional impact was profound. To break that oath was to betray the living and the dead, and such betrayal was often considered worse than death itself. In these rituals, the line between savage brutality and sacred devotion blurred, creating a practice that was as much about meaning and belonging as it was about fear. They remind us that in the ancient world, the bonds of warriors were not forged only in battle, but in the rituals of death that bound them together forever. When the warriors of the steppe and forests carried their rituals into battle against the so-called civilized world, the collision was more than military. It was cultural, spiritual, and psychological, a clash of worldviews where skull rituals became both a weapon of fear and a badge of honor. Greek and Roman chroniclers, who prided themselves on order and discipline, often described these practices with revulsion. Yet beneath their condemnation was an unmistakable undertone of awe. For how could one not be shaken by facing an enemy who not only fought without hesitation but who believed that death itself would serve his strength? These were not ordinary opponents. They were men bound by rituals that made them feel invincible, and that aura could unsettle even the most disciplined legion. Accounts tell of encounters where the aftermath of battle revealed more than corpses. Romans described shrines built from skulls, captured enemies whose heads were displayed on walls, and feasts where bones of the fallen became sacred vessels. For the victors who practiced such rituals, this was not desecration but consecration. Each skull became a testament to courage and a reminder that life was fragile. For outsiders, however, the sight was horrifying. To march into a battlefield where the enemy drank from the skulls of past foes was to fight not just men but a living myth, one that declared the power of death itself was on their side. The psychological impact cannot be understated. Roman discipline was legendary, but their soldiers were still human, and fear was contagious. To believe that the man across the field saw your head as a future drinking cup was to realize the stakes went far beyond victory or defeat. It was the obliteration of identity, the transformation of self into a symbol of someone else's triumph. The fear this inspired was deliberate, part of the ritual's purpose, and it worked as surely as any spear or sword. At the same time, for the warriors who practiced these rituals, it was a source of inner strength. Bound by oaths sealed in bone and blood, they believed themselves linked to the spirits of the dead and empowered by the ferocity of past victories. To them, each clash was not only for land or survival but for the affirmation of their bond. The skull ritual stood as proof that they could not be divided, and that their unity was stronger than any foreign army's formations or strategies. The ritual was both shield and weapon, belief turned into action. This clash reached its height as Rome expanded into lands inhabited by Celts, Thracians, and Germanic tribes. Battles were fought not only with iron but with ideas, discipline versus ferocity, law versus ritual, civilization versus what they called barbarism. Yet the truth was far more complex. While Rome dismissed skull rituals as savage, they could not deny that such acts inspired loyalty, courage, and fear in ways their own traditions could not. The field became a stage where death itself was harnessed, where rituals turned warriors into legends and battles into timeless clashes of faith and identity. In the forests and fjords of the north, echoes of the old skull rituals lingered, reshaped by new cultures yet carrying the same essence of binding warriors together through death and remembrance. Among the Germanic tribes and later the Vikings, the skull itself did not always serve as the literal vessel, but its symbolic presence endured in the rituals of blood and bone that sealed loyalty. These were people whose lives revolved around raiding, feasting, and fighting, and every oath had to be stronger than steel. Drinking together, swearing by sacred relics, and invoking the memory of the dead were practices that transformed warbands into families. A man who stood in a shield wall was more than a fighter, he was bound by ritual to those at his side, and the imagery of skulls, whether in song, saga, or carved into drinking horns, reminded him of the fate that awaited betrayers. The sagas of the North often speak of feasts where warriors swore eternal loyalty over vessels carved from bone or horns etched with symbols of death. While later Christian writers tried to suppress or reinterpret these traditions, the essence of them survived in oral tales. Archaeological finds reveal horns decorated with imagery of skulls and bones, alongside burial sites where warriors were laid to rest with drinking vessels by their side, as if the oath sworn in life carried into the afterlife. Such rituals reinforced the belief that loyalty outlasted death, that comradeship was eternal, and that betrayal condemned a man not only in this world but in the next. The Viking practice of the blood oath reflects this continuity most clearly. 2 or more warriors would mingle their blood in a vessel, often while invoking the gods and spirits of the dead. To drink from that cup was to take a sacred vow, a promise that no force on earth could undo. In this act we see the same logic that once guided the skull ritual, the reminder that death stood close at hand, that life was fleeting, and that only unity could make men endure. To share such a moment was to declare oneself part of a brotherhood as binding as kinship, one where the penalty for betrayal was dishonor and eternal shame. Even as centuries passed and societies changed, the symbolism of bone and blood retained its grip on the imagination of the North. Warriors sang of heroes who had bound themselves through sacred feasting, who had shared drink under the watchful eyes of the dead, and who faced their enemies without fear because they knew they would never stand alone. These rituals were not only about violence, they were about belonging, remembrance, and the creation of unbreakable trust. In the end, the skull ritual's echoes in the North reveal how deeply ancient ideas of death and unity shaped the lives of those who carried sword and shield into battle. The legacy of skull rituals lingers like a shadow cast across centuries, a reminder of how deeply humans have sought meaning in death and loyalty. Though the literal practices have vanished, their echoes remain in the way we still tell stories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the bonds forged through shared struggle. To the warriors of the past, raising a skull cup or swearing an oath in the presence of the dead was not savagery but sanctity. It was a way to turn fleeting lives into something eternal, to transform fear into unity, and to ensure that no man stood alone in the face of mortality. The imagery remains haunting precisely because it touches something universal, the need to belong, to be remembered, and to leave behind a legacy greater than oneself. Modern fascination with these ancient rituals is everywhere, from films that dramatize Viking feasts to games that place skulls as symbols of victory and strength. Even in popular culture, the skull retains its aura of defiance and endurance, reminding us of a time when men believed death could be conquered not by avoiding it but by embracing it. The persistence of these images reveals a truth: while the rituals have changed, the desire to forge unbreakable bonds through shared hardship has not. Whether in the trenches of modern wars, the pledges of secret societies, or the loyalty sworn between comrades, the echoes of ancient skull rituals still resound, disguised but never silenced. Yet reflection also forces us to ask difficult questions. Were these acts a celebration of loyalty, or evidence of how far humanity can descend into brutality? Can we separate the sacred from the savage, the honor from the horror? The ambiguity is what gives these rituals their power. They confront us with the unsettling reality that violence and devotion often walked hand in hand, that even the most terrifying acts could be born from the deepest yearning for unity and meaning. As the fires of history fade, the skull ritual stands as a haunting symbol of how warriors tried to bind themselves beyond death. It compels us to wonder whether, in our own ways, we still seek the same through different forms. The vessels have changed, but the need remains. Brotherhood, loyalty, and remembrance are as enduring as bone. And in that truth, we see that the ritual, though buried in time, has never truly left us.